The C-130 cargo plane was carrying routine supplies and 6 passengers across Europe. Among them sat Sarah Chen, a quiet woman in casual clothes. Nobody suspected she was the legendary Cobra 1, the most decorated A-10 combat pilot. But when 2 fighter jets suddenly stopped their mission mid-air, her secret was revealed. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Sarah Chen settled into the uncomfortable canvas seat of the C-130 cargo plane, adjusting her small backpack between her feet. The massive transport aircraft sat on the tarmac at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, its 4 turboprop engines idling with a steady drone that would soon become deafening. She was one of only 6 passengers on this routine cargo flight to Aviano Air Base in Italy, a quick 2-hour hop across the Alps that military personnel called a trash hauler or channel flight. At 42 years old, Sarah looked like any other civilian contractor heading to a meeting at one of the European bases. She wore plain khaki pants, a simple blue windbreaker, and comfortable walking shoes. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her only jewelry was a simple watch on her left wrist. Nothing about her appearance suggested that she had once been one of the most decorated combat pilots in the United States Air Force. The loadmaster, a young sergeant with barely 3 years of service, walked through the cargo bay doing his final passenger check. "Ma'am, we'll be taking off in about 10 minutes. It's going to get loud, so you might want these," he said, offering her a pair of foam earplugs. "Thanks," Sarah replied with a slight smile, accepting the earplugs. She had flown in C-130s dozens of times during her military career, both as a passenger and occasionally helping with cargo operations between combat missions. The noise didn't bother her anymore. The other passengers were a mix of military personnel and contractors. 2 Army sergeants sat across from her, playing cards on a small folding table they had set up. A Navy lieutenant commander was reading a technical manual, his brow furrowed in concentration. An older civilian man, probably a defense contractor, was already dozing with his arms crossed over his chest. The 6th passenger was an Air Force captain who kept glancing at Sarah with a look of vague recognition, as if trying to place her face. Sarah pulled out her tablet and opened the presentation she needed to review. As a civilian aviation consultant now, she spent her days advising military units on close air support tactics and pilot training programs. It was fulfilling work, but nothing compared to the adrenaline and purpose she had felt during her 12 years as an A-10 Thunderbolt II pilot. The C-130's engines roared to life, the vibration running through the entire airframe. Sarah felt the familiar sensation as the big transport began to taxi toward the runway. She glanced out the small porthole window beside her seat, watching the German countryside slide past. The sky was clear and blue, perfect flying weather. Within minutes, they were airborne. The C-130 climbed steadily, banking slightly as it turned south toward Italy. Sarah returned her attention to her tablet, reviewing the training scenarios she would be presenting to the fighter squadron at Aviano. She was so focused on her work that she didn't notice when the Air Force captain stood up and made his way across the cargo bay toward her. "Excuse me, ma'am," the captain said, his voice raised to be heard over the engine noise. "I'm sorry to bother you, but are you Sarah Chen?" Sarah looked up, surprised. "Yes, I am." The captain's face broke into a wide smile. "I thought so. Ma'am, I'm Captain Mike Torres. I flew A-10s out of Bagram in 2019. You were already retired by then, but your call sign was legendary in the squadron. You're Cobra 1, right?" Sarah felt a familiar mix of pride and discomfort at being recognized. She had tried to leave her military identity behind when she retired 3 years ago, but the aviation community was small, and her reputation had a way of following her. "That was a long time ago, Captain." "Not that long, ma'am," Torres said enthusiastically. "We still study your missions in weapons school. The Ghazni province rescue in 2015. That's textbook close air support. You stayed overhead for 9 hours, made 43 gun runs, and brought every single soldier home. That's the stuff of legend. The two army sergeants had stopped their card game and were now listening with interest. Even the Navy lieutenant commander had looked up from his manual. Sarah nodded politely. "I was just doing my job, Captain. Same as every other pilot out there." "With all due respect, ma'am, not every pilot could do what you did," Torres insisted. "The precision you showed, the risk management, the way you coordinated with ground forces, that's why they call the Chen method the gold standard for danger close operations now." Before Sarah could respond, the loadmaster came back through the cargo bay. "Captain Torres, the pilots up front want to see you for a second." Torres excused himself and headed toward the cockpit. Sarah tried to return to her work, but she could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her now. The older of the two army sergeants leaned forward. "Ma'am, did you really fly A-10s in combat?" he asked. "I did," Sarah confirmed. "For about 8 years, mostly in Afghanistan." The sergeant's face lit up with recognition. "Sergeant First Class Davis, ma'am. I did 3 tours in Afghanistan. The Warthog was our guardian angel. Every grunt in the army loves that plane and the pilots who fly it. You saved a lot of lives over there." "A lot of pilots saved a lot of lives," Sarah said gently. "It was a team effort." "But you were one of the best," Davis insisted. "I remember hearing stories about Cobra 1. They said you could put a 30mm round through a car window from 2 miles away." Sarah smiled slightly. "The GAU-8 cannon is a very precise weapon when you know how to use it." The Navy lieutenant commander closed his manual and extended his hand. "Commander Jeff Matthews, ma'am. I'm a naval aviator myself, though I fly Super Hornets off carriers. I've read the after-action reports from some of your missions. Your tactics have influenced how we approach close air support in the Navy as well." The conversation was interrupted by Captain Torres returning from the cockpit. His expression had changed from friendly enthusiasm to something more serious and respectful. "Ma'am," Torres said, "the pilots would like to speak with you. Would you mind coming up to the flight deck?" Sarah was puzzled but stood up. "Of course." She followed Torres through the cargo bay and up the short ladder to the C-130's flight deck. The cockpit was cramped, filled with instruments and switches, with barely enough room for the 2 pilots, flight engineer, and navigator who were managing the aircraft. The pilot in command, a lieutenant colonel with gray hair and at least 20 years of experience, turned in his seat to look at Sarah. "Ms. Chen, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Brad Stevens. My co-pilot, Major Lisa Park, and I wanted to introduce ourselves properly. We just received a radio call from Italian air traffic control with some unusual information." "Unusual how?" Sarah asked. "We're currently flying through military training airspace," Stevens explained. "There are 2 A-10 Thunderbolts conducting exercises about 20 miles south of our position. When they heard our call sign and flight plan, they asked air traffic control if we had a passenger named Sarah Chen aboard." Sarah's stomach tightened. "How would they know I'm on this flight?" Major Park spoke up. "The manifest is available to military air operations centers. Apparently, someone at Aviano saw your name on the passenger list for this flight and passed the information to the training squadron. The A-10 flight lead is requesting permission to intercept our flight path." "Intercept?" Sarah was confused. Why would they intercept a cargo flight? Lieutenant Colonel Stevens smiled. "Ma'am, I think they want to honor you. The flight lead specifically asked if Cobra 1 was aboard. When we confirmed, he requested permission from air traffic control to perform a tribute formation." Sarah felt her cheeks flush. "That's not necessary. I'm just a passenger on a cargo hop." "With respect, ma'am," Stevens said, "you're a legend in the A-10 community. These young pilots want to show their respect. We've been given clearance to slow our speed and maintain altitude while they approach. If you're willing, we'd like to let them conduct a formal escort." Sarah looked out the cockpit windscreen at the clear sky ahead. Somewhere out there, 2 warthogs were changing course to intercept this lumbering cargo plane, just to honor her service. The gesture touched her more deeply than she wanted to admit. "All right," she said quietly. "If it means that much to them." Major Park pointed to a jump seat behind the co-pilot's position. "You can sit here and watch, ma'am. They should be visible in about 5 minutes." Sarah strapped herself into the jump seat, accepting a spare headset so she could listen to the radio communications. Captain Torres had crowded into the cockpit doorway, not wanting to miss the moment. The radio crackled to life. "Ramstein Cargo 347, this is Hog 1. We have you on radar at your 11 o'clock position, range 15 miles. Request permission to approach and establish formation." Lieutenant Colonel Stevens keyed his microphone. "Hog 1, Ramstein Cargo 347. You're cleared to approach. We're maintaining heading 185, altitude 22,000 feet, airspeed 250 knots. Roger, Cargo 347. Hog flight is approaching from your port side. We'll be taking up escort positions momentarily." Sarah's trained eyes scanned the sky to the left of the C-130. Within moments, she spotted them, 2 dark specks growing rapidly larger against the blue sky. The distinctive profile of the A-10 Thunderbolt II became clear: the straight wings, the twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, and the massive nose cannon that made the aircraft one of the most feared ground attack platforms ever built. The lead A-10 approached smoothly, its pilot flying with the kind of precision that came from hundreds of hours of training. The aircraft took up a position about 50 feet off the C-130's left wing, perfectly matching the cargo plane's speed and altitude. Seconds later, the second Warthog appeared on the right side, creating a symmetric escort formation. Sarah could see both pilots clearly through their canopies. They were young, probably in their late 20s or early 30s, representing a new generation of A-10 pilots carrying forward the mission she had once flown. The radio came alive again, but this time the voice was different, more formal, more reverent. "Cobra 1, this is Hog 1. Ma'am, it is an honor to share this airspace with you today." Lieutenant Colonel Stevens handed the microphone to Sarah. For a moment, she just held it, feeling the weight of what was happening. Then she keyed the transmit button. "Hog 1, this is Cobra 1. The honor is mine. You boys are flying some beautiful formations out there." "Thank you, ma'am," the A-10 pilot responded. "We've been given permission to escort you to Aviano. If you're willing, we'd like to perform a tribute pass when we reach the base." Sarah glanced at Lieutenant Colonel Stevens, who nodded his approval. She keyed the microphone again. "Hog 1, I'd be honored." What followed was 15 minutes of the most precise formation flying Sarah had ever witnessed from the cockpit of a cargo aircraft. The 2 A-10s maintained perfect position on either side of the C-130, their pilots making tiny adjustments to stay in formation as the larger aircraft descended toward Aviano. Through her headset, Sarah could hear the radio chatter between the A-10 pilots and Italian air traffic control. Word of the tribute formation had spread quickly, and controllers were clearing airspace to give the 3 aircraft room to maneuver. "Cargo 347, Aviano Tower. Be advised, we have personnel gathering on the flight line to observe your arrival. The base commander has been notified of the situation." Lieutenant Colonel Stevens responded with a touch of amusement in his voice. "Roger, Aviano Tower. We'll try to make it a good show." In the back of the C-130, the other passengers had crowded around the small porthole windows, watching the A-10s flying alongside them. Sergeant Davis was pointing excitedly, explaining to the younger sergeant what they were witnessing. As the flight approached Aviano Air Base, the Italian Alps providing a stunning backdrop, the A-10 flight lead came back on the radio. "Cobra 1, Hog 1. We're going to execute a tactical break in approximately 2 minutes. It's been an absolute privilege flying with you, ma'am." "Hog 1, Cobra 1, Sarah responded, her voice steady despite the emotion welling up inside her. "Thank you for your service. Keep bringing everyone home." That's the mission, ma'am. Always has been, always will be. The C-130 lined up for its final approach to Aviano's runway. At precisely the right moment, both A-10s executed a perfect tactical brake maneuver. The lead aircraft rolled sharply to the left and pulled up in a climbing spiral, the second aircraft mirroring the maneuver to the right. The two warthogs climbed away from the cargo plane in opposite directions, their contrails painting white lines across the blue Italian sky. It was one of the most beautiful things Sarah had ever seen. The C-130 touched down smoothly on Aviano's runway and began its taxi to the cargo terminal. Through the cockpit windows, Sarah could see that a significant crowd had gathered on the flight line. There had to be at least 100 people standing behind the safety barriers, all watching the cargo plane's arrival. "Looks like you've got a welcoming committee, ma'am," Major Park said with a smile. Sarah felt a mix of emotions: pride, embarrassment, gratitude, and something deeper, a sense of connection to a community she had thought she left behind when she retired. The C-130 came to a complete stop, and the engines began to wind down. The loadmaster opened the rear cargo ramp, flooding the dim interior with bright Italian sunlight. Sarah made her way back through the cargo bay, where the other passengers were gathering their belongings. Captain Torres approached her with a respectful nod. "Ma'am, I think you should exit first. Those people out there are waiting for you." Sarah took a deep breath and walked down the cargo ramp. The moment she appeared, the crowd erupted in applause. She stopped, momentarily overwhelmed by the sight before her. The gathering included personnel from every branch of service: Air Force pilots in flight suits, Army soldiers in combat uniforms, Navy personnel from the nearby base, and even Italian Air Force officers. At the front of the crowd stood a two-star general in Air Force blues, flanked by several colonels and senior enlisted personnel. The general stepped forward and saluted sharply. Sarah, though retired and in civilian clothes, instinctively returned the salute. "Ms. Chen," the general said, extending his hand, "I'm Major General Robert Hayes, Commander of Allied Air Forces Southern Europe. I apologize for the impromptu reception, but when we learned that Cobra 1 was arriving at our base, we couldn't let the moment pass without proper recognition." "Sir, this really isn't necessary," Sarah began, but the general cut her off gently. "Ma'am, with respect, it's absolutely necessary. The men and women gathered here represent a community that understands what you accomplished during your service. Many of these pilots have studied your missions. Some of these soldiers owe their lives to A-10 pilots who followed the tactics you pioneered. This isn't just about honoring you, it's about honoring what you represent." From the back of the crowd, someone started a slow clap. Within seconds, everyone had joined in, creating a thunderous ovation that echoed across the flight line. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes despite her best efforts to maintain composure. A young Air Force lieutenant approached hesitantly, carrying a well-worn flight manual. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Amy Foster. I'm going through A-10 training right now. Would you mind signing my tactics manual? Your missions are all through this book." Sarah took the manual and looked at it. Sure enough, several sections referenced her call sign, describing techniques and procedures that had become standard practice in the A-10 community. She signed the manual with a brief message: "Bring them home. Cobra 1 inch." Over the next 30 minutes, Sarah found herself surrounded by military personnel wanting to shake her hand, take photos, or simply say thank you. An Army Master Sergeant approached with tears in his eyes. "Ma'am, I was part of a convoy in Helmand Province in 2016. We got hit by an IED and then ambushed. We called for air support, and a pilot with the call sign Cobra 1 showed up within 10 minutes. You made gun runs so close that we could see the brass casings falling around us. You saved 12 soldiers that day. I was one of them." Sarah grasped the soldier's hand firmly. "What's your name, Sergeant?" "Master Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez, ma'am." "Sergeant Rodriguez, I remember that mission. I remember every mission. And I remember that you and your soldiers fought like hell that day. The air support only works because troops on the ground are brave enough to mark targets and trust us to get it right. You saved yourselves. I just provided the firepower. Rodriguez shook his head. Ma'am, without you, none of us would have made it home. My daughter was born 3 months after that deployment. I got to hold her because of what you did that day. The conversation was interrupted by the distinctive sound of jet engines. Sarah looked up to see the two A-10s making a low pass over the airfield, flying in tight formation directly over the gathered crowd. As they passed overhead, both aircraft rolled inverted in perfect synchronization, then rolled back upright and climbed away toward the mountains. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Even the seasoned military personnel were moved by the display. General Hayes appeared at Sarah's side again. Ms. Chen, I understand you're here as a consultant to provide training to our fighter squadrons. I'd like to extend an invitation for you to speak to our pilots this evening. There's a lot they could learn from hearing directly from you about real-world close air support operations. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before nodding. I'd be honored, sir. That evening, Sarah found herself standing in front of a briefing room filled with pilots from the fighter squadron based at Aviano. The room was packed, with standing room only. Pilots of all ranks and experience levels had come to hear her speak. She had prepared a formal presentation about modern close air support tactics, but looking at the eager faces before her, she decided to take a different approach. I'm going to set aside the PowerPoint slides, Sarah began. Instead, I want to talk to you about what really matters when you're flying close air support missions. It's not about the technical procedures or the weapons systems, though those are important. It's about understanding that every time you fly a combat mission, you're holding lives in your hands. For the next hour, Sarah shared stories from her combat experience. She talked about the fear she felt during her first mission under fire. She described the bond between pilots and ground troops, built on trust and mutual respect. She explained how she developed the techniques that became known as the Chin method, born from necessity during a particularly difficult mission when conventional approaches weren't working. The most important thing I learned, Sarah said, is that close air support is a sacred trust. When a soldier on the ground calls for help, he's trusting you with his life and the lives of his friends. That trust cannot be broken. It doesn't matter if you're tired, or scared, or if the situation is incredibly dangerous. When they call, you answer. When they need you, you're there. That's the mission. That's always been the mission. A young lieutenant raised his hand. Ma'am, how did you handle the pressure? Knowing that if you made a mistake, people could die. Sarah was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. You never stop feeling that pressure, and you shouldn't. The day you stop feeling it is the day you become dangerous. But you train until the procedures become instinct. You study until you know every capability and limitation of your aircraft. You practice until you can deliver ordnance accurately in the worst conditions. And then you trust your training. Another pilot asked, "What was your closest call?" Sarah smiled grimly. There were several, but one stands out. It was a night mission in 2014. A special forces team was pinned down in a valley, taking fire from 3 directions. I had to make gun runs with less than 75 meters of separation from friendly forces, at night, in mountainous terrain. I made 17 passes, and by the end, my aircraft had taken multiple hits from small arms fire. But every member of that special forces team made it home. How did you maintain accuracy in those conditions? Someone asked. Practice, patience, and communication, Sarah answered. I was in constant contact with the ground controller. He trusted me to get close, and I trusted him to mark targets accurately. That relationship, that mutual trust, is what makes close air support work. The questions continued for another hour. By the end of the session, Sarah felt drained but satisfied. She had shared not just tactical knowledge but the philosophy and mindset that had guided her through hundreds of combat missions. As the pilots filed out of the briefing room, many stopped to thank her personally. Several asked for photos, which she obliged. Captain Torres, who had recognized her on the C-130, approached with a serious expression. "Ma'am, I want you to know that everything we do in the A-10 community builds on the foundation you helped create. The tactics, the procedures, the mindset, you influenced all of it. Every time I fly a mission, I try to live up to the standard you set." Sarah placed a hand on the young captain's shoulder. "Then you're doing it for the right reasons. Just remember, it's not about living up to anyone's legacy. It's about bringing everyone home. That's the only standard that matters." Later that night, Sarah stood on the balcony of her temporary quarters at Aviano, looking out over the Italian Alps silhouetted against the starlit sky. She thought about the day's events, the unexpected tribute from the A-10 pilots, the gathering on the flight line, the opportunity to speak with the next generation of combat aviators. For 3 years, she had tried to move forward into civilian life, to leave behind the identity she had built during her military service. She had thought that becoming a consultant was enough, that she could contribute from the sidelines without being pulled back into that world. But today had shown her something different. Her service hadn't ended when she retired. The legacy she had built, the tactics she had developed, the standards she had set, the example she had provided, continued to influence and inspire active duty pilots. By sharing her knowledge and experience, she was still serving, just in a different capacity. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the soldier who had approached her on the flight line. The message included a photo of him holding his young daughter, now about 5 years old. The caption read, "Thank you for making this possible. She'll grow up knowing that heroes are real." Sarah stared at the photo for a long time, feeling the weight of what it represented. This was why she had served. Not for recognition or glory, but for moments like this, a father holding his daughter because he had survived a combat deployment. A family that remained whole because she had done her job well. She replied with a simple message, "She's beautiful. Take care of each other." As Sarah prepared for bed, she reflected on how much her perspective had changed in just one day. She had boarded a routine cargo flight that morning as a civilian consultant trying to leave her military identity behind. She was ending the day as Cobra 1 again, not in terms of active service, but as a member of a community that transcended retirement. The A-10 pilots who had intercepted her flight had given her something precious, a reminder that service doesn't end with retirement, that the bonds forged in military aviation are permanent, and that the impact of one's actions can echo long after the last mission is flown. She thought about the young pilots she had spoken with that evening, eager, professional, dedicated to the mission. They were the future of close air support aviation, carrying forward traditions and techniques that she had helped develop. In teaching them, in sharing her experience, she was ensuring that future soldiers would have the same guardian angels overhead that had saved so many during her time in combat. Sarah Chen, Cobra 1, finally understood that she hadn't left her military identity behind. She had simply evolved it. She was no longer flying combat missions, but she was still serving the mission in every way that mattered. As she drifted off to sleep, her last thought was of the two A-10s flying formation with the C-130, a symbol of respect and continuity between generations of warriors. Tomorrow, she would continue her work as a consultant, but now she would do it with a renewed sense of purpose. She was still bringing everyone home. Just in a different way. The next morning, Sarah woke to find that video of the tribute formation had gone viral on military social media. Someone had filmed the A-10s escorting the C-130 and the subsequent flyby over Aviano, and the footage had been shared thousands of times. The comment section was filled with stories from veterans who had been saved by A-10 pilots, from active duty personnel expressing their respect, and from civilians thanking her for her service. At breakfast in the base dining facility, Sarah found herself recognized everywhere she went. But instead of feeling uncomfortable, she felt a sense of peace. This was her community, these were her people, and her story was part of a larger narrative about service, sacrifice, and the bonds that connect those who have served. General Hayes found her after breakfast and extended an invitation to visit other NATO bases in Europe to speak with pilots and share her expertise. Sarah accepted without hesitation. She finally understood that her retirement from active duty didn't mean retirement from service. As she prepared for another day of meetings and training sessions, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. From her first solo flight in an A-10 to her final combat mission, from her retirement ceremony to this unexpected revival of her call sign, every step had been part of a larger path. She had been just another passenger on a routine cargo hop. But when her call sign stopped the A-10's mid-air, it had stopped her as well, stopped her from running away from who she was, stopped her from diminishing what she had accomplished, stopped her from forgetting that some identities are too important to leave behind. Cobra 1 was more than a call sign. It was a standard of excellence, a symbol of dedication to the mission, and a reminder that the greatest honor in military aviation is earning the trust of those who depend on you to bring them home. And that mission, Sarah now understood, was never truly complete. It continued in every pilot she trained, every story she shared, every young aviator who learned from her experience and carried those lessons forward. She picked up her briefing materials and headed out into the Italian morning, ready for whatever the day would bring. The sky was clear and blue, perfect flying weather, just like the day before. And somewhere overhead, A-10s were flying their missions, carrying forward a legacy that would never die. That evening, as Sarah walked across the flight line at sunset, she heard the familiar sound of turbofan engines. 2 A-10s were returning from their training mission, touching down on the runway in perfect sequence. The pilots taxied past her, and through the canopy, she could see them render crisp salutes. She returned the gesture with pride. In that moment, Sarah realized that retirement hadn't ended her story, it had simply opened a new chapter. The call sign Cobra 1 would continue to inspire, guide, and protect long after she was gone, living on in the hearts and minds of every pilot who understood the sacred mission: bring everyone home, always. She pulled out her phone and sent a message to her former squadron: once a Warthog pilot, always a Warthog pilot. Within seconds, responses flooded in from across the world, from pilots in combat zones, training bases, and retirement homes. They all shared one thing: an unbreakable bond forged in the skies above battlefields, a commitment that transcended time and distance.